Hi everyone, this is your second of two videos from section 1.1, Analyzing Categorical Data. Make sure to title your notes with that section and list the three learning targets from this video. Calculate marginal and joint relative frequencies from a two-way table, calculate conditional relative frequencies from a two-way table, and describe the nature of the association between two categorical variables. Pause here to get your notes set up before moving on to the next slide. Take a look at this table. What do you notice? What do you wonder? Pause to think about it. A couple things I notice is that there are two different sections or categories in the table, survival status and class of travel. I wonder why the biggest number shows people who died in the third class at 476. That was an example of a two-way table that showed counts which summarized data on the relationship between two different categorical variables, class of travel and survival status. That data is from passengers on the Titanic. Notice that the data you looked at in the first slide, the blue table, only listed the number of counts in each category for survived or died and first, second, and third class. Notice that two-way tables are a lot easier to read if we first find the row totals and the column totals if they're not already included. That's what the pink or red table down below shows, the original data in the 6 different cells, as well as the total of each row, the total of each column, which both add up to the 1,207 passengers on the Titanic. When we're looking at a two-way table, we can calculate marginal relative frequencies. These are the percent or proportion of individuals that have a specific value for one of the categorical variables. The reason they're called marginal relative frequency is we calculate them using the margins of a two-way table. We can also calculate another frequency from two-way tables called the joint relative frequency, which is the percent or proportion of individuals that have a specific value for one categorical and one specific value of another categorical variable. These are calculated using a specific cell where one row and one column intersect. The reason they're called joint is just like a joint in your body that connects two different bones. A joint relative frequency connects one row with one column, and it's where they intersect. So let's take a look at this to get some practice. Here we're back to our passengers on the Titanic. One question we could ask is what proportion of adult passengers on the Titanic survived? This is going to be a marginal relative frequency because to find the proportion of adults that survived, we're going to look at the total for the survived row. Notice that total is in the margin. So again, that's why it's called a marginal relative frequency. And when we say the proportion who survived, we want to take the number that survived out of the total passengers, which is 1,207. So 442 divided by 1,207 gives us 0.366 or 36.6% of the passengers on the Titanic survived. Here's another example. Find the distribution of class of travel for adult passengers on the Titanic using relative frequencies. So when it says distribution of class of travel, that means it wants you to find the marginal distribution, but for each class of travel. So for first class, second class, and third class passengers. So we want to essentially know what percentage of passengers on the Titanic rode in the first class, which percentage in the second, and which in the third. This is again calculated using numbers in the margins. So I'll take the percent of passengers in first class, 319, divided by the total. Then I'll do the same for second class, 261, divided by the total, 1,207. And finally for third class, the 627, divided by the total. That gives us our marginal distribution, that the first class passengers were 0.264 or 26.4% of the passengers. Second class was 21.6%, and third class was 51.9%. Anytime you're finding an entire distribution, you should find that the percentages either add up to 100%, or in this case, add up to very close to 100% if there's some rounding involved. Here's an example where we get to see a joint relative frequency. The question asked here is what percent of adult passengers on the Titanic traveled in third class and survived? That "and" word is our key that this is a joint relative frequency. It shows where two different categorical variables intersect. The third class passengers, that column, where does that intersect the row of survived? So we're going to use the number 151 that represents the third class passengers who survived out of the total passengers on the Titanic, which is still 1,207. So I can see that the third class passengers who survived made up just 0.125 or 12.5% of the total passengers on the Titanic. Another thing we can calculate from a two-way table is the conditional relative frequency. That is also a percent or proportion of individuals who have a specific value for one categorical variable, but specifically among individuals who share that same value of another categorical variable. Let's take a look at what this looks like in an example. Here the question is, what proportion of survivors were third-class passengers? So this is a conditional relative frequency because I'm specifically looking at the proportion of survivors. So I want to be focused just on the people who survived. Out of those people who survived, 442, how many of them were third-class passengers, which is 151. So what makes this as a conditional relative frequency problem is I'm not taking anything out of the total passengers on the Titanic. Instead, I'm taking the number of third-class survival candidates out of the total who survived. So 151 divided by 442, which gives us 0.342 or 34.2% of the survivors came from third class. Here's another example. What percent of the first class passengers survived? So again, I'm looking just at first class passengers, and out of the first class passengers, 319, what percent of them survived? So I'm going to use that number, 197. Sorry about that green circle. Not certain how that got there, but we're going to use 197 divided by 319 to give us a total of 0.618 or 61.8%. Notice that more than half of the first class passengers had a survival chance. So now that we've learned to calculate some different things from two-way tables, let's look at some different ways that we can display two categorical variables. There's three different visual displays. The first is a side-by-side bar graph, where we would have bars side by side that are grouped based on one of the categorical variables. And there would be a group for each value of the second categorical variable. We're going to see an example of each of these on the next slide. Here we're just going to write down their definitions. Another visual display of two categorical variables is a segmented bar graph, where we see the distribution of a categorical variable as segments of a rectangle, and the area of each segment is proportional to the percent of individuals in that category. And the third type of visual display for two categorical variables is a mosaic plot, which is basically a modified version of the segmented bar graph in which the width of each rectangle is proportional to the number of individuals in the corresponding category. These definitions probably won't make a ton of sense right now, but I would recommend you write down their definitions so that you can look at them alongside the visual displays. So here are our visual displays. Each of these are for the distribution of snowmobile use amongst environmental club members and among non-environmental club members from the 1,526 randomly selected winter visitors to Yellowstone National Park. Notice in the first graph, the side-by-side bar graph, I see bars side by side for people who are not environmental club members. Then I also see bars side by side for people who, yes, are environmental club members. From here, it's very easy to see that many people who are members of the environmental club never have owned a snowmobile. It's also very easy to see that people who are environmental club members very infrequently do own a snowmobile, versus those who are not members of the environmental club, their snowmobile ownership is much more evenly distributed. Similarly, on graph B, which is a segmented bar graph, I can see each part, each category, no, they're not members versus yes, they are members, is divided up out of 0 to 100%. Each part of the bar has been segmented to be proportional to how many people own a snowmobile, rent a snowmobile, or have never ridden a snowmobile. Again, I can see that those who have never ridden a snowmobile is much higher if they are environmental club members versus not. And finally, down in the mosaic plot, which is graph C down below, I can see that many more of the respondents were not environmental club members. So this mosaic plot shows me that of the 1,526 people who responded to this survey, a lot more of them were not environmental club members than who said yes, based on the distribution of each of these bars. I can also see pretty clearly that the distribution for people who are not environmental club members is pretty even for owning a snowmobile, renting versus never. And again, the distribution is much higher for those who are environmental club members who have never owned a snowmobile. Each of these graphs shows us the same information, just in a slightly different way. None of them is better than any of the others. They just are different ways to show two categorical variables together. It's not so important that you are able to construct one of these graphs completely on your own, so much as it is important that you're able to understand them and interpret them. Finally, why would we use these graphs? We would use these to be able to tell if there is an association between two variables. An association would mean that knowing the value of one variable helps us predict the value of the other. Then we would say there's an association between the two. Alternatively, if knowing the value of one variable does not help us predict the value of the other, then we would say there's no association between the variables. So let's circle back to our Titanic example. If we look at the conditional frequencies for first class, second class, and third class, comparing the percent of that class who survived versus died, either in the data, which is shown on the left, or in the segmented bar chart, do we think there's an association between class and survival? Take a look at the data in the segmented bar chart to make a decision. Indeed, we notice that yes, there is an association between class and survival on the Titanic. First-class passengers survived at a much higher proportion, 61.8% of them survived, compared to only 36% of second-class passengers survived, or just 24.1% of third-class passengers survived. I can see that in the data as well as in the segmented bar chart, where I can see the blue bar for survived is much larger for first class than it is for second class or for third class. This is the end of your second video on section 1.1, Analyzing Categorical Data. After watching this video, you should know how to calculate marginal and joint relative frequencies, conditional relative frequencies, and also determine if there is an association between two categorical variables.